You don't throw away a daughter unless you're afraid of what she might become. The words echoed through Jackson Reed's mind as the crystal doors of Baron Virex's grand hall sealed behind him with a hydraulic hiss, the sound sharp and final, like a vault locking shut. The air inside the chamber carried a faint metallic tang, filtered and perfumed to hide the scent of ozone from the floating chandeliers above. Light refracted through violet crystal columns, scattering fractured rainbows across polished marble floors that stretched wider than a football field. Jackson stood alone at the center, boots dusty from a week in the outer mines, black jacket creased and worn at the elbows. He was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably human. Pale skin, short brown hair, blue eyes that had seen too many deals go sideways. In this place of shimmering alien silk and silver armor, he looked like a smudge of charcoal on polished glass. Baron Virex lounged on an elevated throne carved from translucent stone, his blue-silver skin gleaming under the lights, long fingers steepled in idle amusement. "You came for credits," the Baron said, voice smooth as cold steel. "Instead, I offer you something far more entertaining." A soft mechanical whir cut through the chamber. A curtain of light parted. A levitating platform drifted forward, silent except for the faint hum of anti-grav coils. On it sat a young alien woman, upright but unmoving from the waist down, her posture rigid with pride rather than weakness. Her skin held the same luminous blue-silver hue as her father's, but her eyes, clear, icy, and unyielding, burned brighter than anything in the hall. She wore a simple dark tunic, nothing ornate, nothing royal. Stripped of ceremony, stripped of dignity. "My daughter," the Baron continued lightly. "Lyra Voss. A brilliant mind, unfortunately attached to a body that no longer cooperates. Consider her a bonus. A joke, perhaps." A ripple of restrained laughter moved through the gathered nobles. Jackson didn't laugh. He didn't glance at her legs. He looked at her eyes, and she looked back at him without blinking. There was no plea in that gaze. No shame. Only calculation. Only fury held on a tight leash. The Baron tilted his head. "Take her. Fix her. Sell her. I no longer require the inconvenience." Jackson's jaw tightened. He had hauled cargo across asteroid belts in freezing vacuum suits. He had patch cracked, hull plating with nothing but sealant and stubbornness. He knew what broken equipment looked like. Lyra Voss was not broken equipment. "She's not a punchline," Jackson said quietly, voice steady despite the weight of 100 watching faces. The chamber went still. The Baron's lips curved. "Careful, human." Jackson stepped closer to the platform, boots echoing softly against the marble. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in Lyra's fingers as she gripped the edge of her seat, not from fear, but from restraint. "Do you want to leave?" he asked her, not the Baron. Her voice, when it came, was low and controlled. "I want choice." It wasn't a dramatic answer. It was simpler than that. Honest. Jackson nodded once. "Then let's start there." He reached for the manual override on the platform's control ring, ignoring the sudden murmur from the nobles. He didn't negotiate price. He didn't bow. The Baron watched with thinly veiled curiosity as Jackson guided the floating chair to his side. "You'll regret attaching yourself to discarded property," the Baron said lazily. Jackson glanced back only once. "I've rebuilt worse with less." And as the great doors began to open again, letting in a thin blade of white daylight from the courtyard beyond, Lyra Voss allowed herself the smallest shift in posture. Not surrender, not gratitude, but something sharper. Hope, perhaps. Or the first move in a game her father no longer controlled. The palace doors closed behind them with a low, resonant thud that seemed to travel up through the soles of Jackson Reed's boots and settle somewhere in his chest. Outside, the courtyard air felt thinner, cooler, carrying the faint scent of ionized stone from the anti-gravity platforms that lined the landing terraces. Lyra's hover chair drifted beside him, its stabilizers humming at a steady pitch, about as loud as a household refrigerator back on Earth. No guards followed. That was what unsettled him most. Baron Virex had let them walk out too easily. Jackson guided the platform down a wide ramp that curved toward the lower docking tiers. The marble gave way to brushed alloy flooring, scuffed from freight carts and supply drones. The glamour of the throne room did not reach this far. "You realize," Lyra said evenly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to being heard. My father does nothing without contingency. Jackson kept his eyes forward. I figured. His cargo shuttle waited 300 feet ahead, matte black hull dulled by micro scratches and long-haul wear. It was not elegant. It was reliable. He keyed the side hatch open with a small transmitter clipped to his belt. The ramp extended with a hydraulic sigh. Do you know why he gave you to me? She asked. He shrugged. He wanted to make a point. No, she replied. He wanted to erase one. That made him glance at her. Up close, under the colder light of the docking bay, he could see the faint shimmer beneath her skin, bioluminescent veins tracing delicate patterns along her temples. Not decoration. Physiology. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her shoulders were drawn tight, like someone bracing for turbulence. Jackson guided the hover chair into the cargo bay and sealed the hatch behind them. The interior smelled faintly of machine oil and recycled air. Overhead strips cast a soft white glow across tool racks, storage crates, and a narrow workbench bolted to the starboard wall. You said you wanted choice, he said, moving toward the control panel to power up the climate system. Here it is. You stay. You leave. I do not sell people. I do not trade them. Lyra studied him with an intensity that felt almost clinical. You speak as if that is uncommon. It is not supposed to be, he answered. A faint vibration rolled through the deck as the ship's auxiliary power came online. Outside, docking clamps disengaged with a metallic click. Jackson moved back toward her chair and crouched slightly, bringing himself to eye level. Before we lift off, I need to check something, he said, gesturing to the control ring beneath her seat. Your stabilization frequency is fluctuating. That is not normal. A flicker crossed her expression. Surprise, quickly masked. You can hear that. I have been around engines most of my life. When something hums wrong, I notice. He reached for a small diagnostic pad from the bench and connected it to the port under her armrest. Numbers scrolled across the screen in blue light. His brow furrowed. This limiter is intentional, he murmured. It is restricting output to about 40%. Lyra went very still. 40%, she repeated quietly. That would explain the pain. Jackson looked up sharply. They told you it was damage. They told me many things. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the ship filled the silence, steady and patient. Jackson exhaled slowly and began adjusting the limiter parameters, fingers moving with careful precision. I am not promising miracles, he said, but I am not leaving it like this. Lyra's gaze did not waver from his face. For the first time since he had seen her behind that curtain of light, something shifted in her eyes. Not hope yet, but recognition, as if she was beginning to understand that he was not rescuing her out of pity. He was correcting a wrong because it was wrong, and that, in a hall of polished cruelty, might have been the most dangerous act of all. The cargo bay lights flickered once as the shuttle lifted free of the docking clamps, a low vibration running through the deck, plating, and into Jackson Reed's knees as he steadied himself beside Lyra's chair. Outside the narrow viewport, the Baron's citadel receded into a lattice of violet towers and suspended walkways, shrinking against the pale sky like a jeweled crown placed too far from its wearer. Jackson focused on the diagnostic pad in his hands. The limiter code was elegant, layered with encryption far beyond what a routine medical safeguard would require. This was not maintenance, he said quietly. It was containment. Lyra's fingers tightened slightly against the armrest. My father believes limitation breeds obedience. The shuttle cleared the lower atmosphere, and gravity shifted as the stabilizers compensated. Jackson adjusted the output incrementally, raising it from 40% to 50, then 55, watching the readouts for any sign of neural overload. Tell me if you feel anything unusual, he said. Her jaw set with controlled determination. I feel everything unusual. A beat passed. Then her shoulders drew in sharply, not in pain, but in sensation. The faint bioluminescent lines along her temples brightened, like distant constellations responding to a change in tide. There is warmth, she said, almost disbelieving. Below the waist. Jackson's expression did not shift into triumph. He simply nodded once and continued calibrating. That means the signal is reaching the spinal interface. It was never fully severed. He moved to the rear of the chair and removed a small panel with the edge of a multi-tool. Inside, the neural couplings glowed a soft blue. One of the conduits had been rerouted through a dampening loop, effectively siphoning off command impulses before they could reach the lower actuators. He did not want you standing, Jackson murmured. He wanted you dependent. Lyra inhaled slowly, steadying herself. In our culture, physical strength is equated with legitimacy. A ruler who cannot stand is seen as incomplete. Jackson glanced at her reflection in the polished alloy wall. Then maybe your culture needs an update. He disengaged the dampening loop and rerouted the conduit directly to the actuator grid, bypassing the restriction entirely. A soft chime indicated a clean circuit. The hum beneath her seat deepened in tone, richer now, like an engine finally allowed to breathe. All right, he said, stepping back into her line of sight. I am going to increase output to 70%. Do not force anything. Let your body respond. The shuttle entered low orbit, stars scattering across the viewport in a silent explosion of light. Lyra closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. Jackson watched the diagnostic screen as muscle fiber readouts began to flicker to life. At first it was subtle, a fractional spike in the lower limb indicators. Then another. Her foot twitched. Barely half an inch, but deliberate. Lyra's eyes flew open. She stared down at the movement, as if witnessing a foreign miracle. That was me, she whispered. Yes, Jackson said simply. No celebration. No dramatic flourish. Just confirmation. She attempted again, and this time her toes flexed visibly against the footrest. The motion was small, perhaps the length of a pencil eraser, but it carried the weight of a revolution. Her breathing grew uneven, not from strain, but from the shock of regained agency. Why? She asked suddenly, lifting her gaze to him. Why help me when you gain nothing? Jackson leaned against the workbench, arms folded loosely across his chest. Because someone tried to convince you that you were less than you are, he said. And I do not like being told what is worth fixing. The shuttle engines engaged for the transfer burn, a steady rumble that vibrated through the hull like distant thunder. Lyra looked down once more at her responding legs, then back at the man who had altered her future with nothing more than tools and stubborn decency. In that moment, the distance between a discarded daughter and a free being narrowed to something measurable, not in miles or credits, but in choice. And for the first time since the curtain had parted in her father's hall, Lyra Voss allowed herself to imagine standing on her own terms. The stars stretched into pale lines as the shuttle completed its transfer burn, settling into a steady cruise toward the outer trade lanes. Inside the cargo bay, the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the ship itself understood something fundamental had shifted. Jackson Reed secured the last panel on Lyra's mobility system and powered down the diagnostic pad. The readouts stabilized at 70% output, steady and responsive. Not perfect, but honest. Lyra remained still for several seconds, studying her legs as if they belonged to someone else. Then, carefully, she placed both hands on the armrests and engaged the actuator grid again. The motors responded with a controlled hum. Her knees straightened slightly, lifting her a few inches higher within the frame. The motion was not graceful. It was mechanical, deliberate, measured in fractions of an inch. But it was hers. A faint sheen of perspiration formed along Jackson's temple as he monitored the neural feedback loop on a secondary display. Do not rush it, he said calmly. Your muscles have been underutilized. They need time. Lyra's jaw tightened with concentration. I am accustomed to time, she replied. There was no bitterness in her tone, only fact. She released the command and eased back down, breathing evenly. The hum subsided. Outside the viewport, a distant cargo freighter drifted past, its running lights blinking red and white in slow rhythm. Civilian traffic. Neutral space. Jackson moved to the cockpit and ran a quick scan of nearby transponders. 2 signals registered within 20,000 miles, both commercial. No sign of pursuit. That did not mean they were untracked. Baron Virex operated through silence, not spectacle. Jackson returned to the cargo bay with 2 insulated water containers and handed one to Lyra. She accepted it, fingers brushing briefly against his. Her skin was cool, but not cold. You altered the limiter without hesitation, she said quietly. You assumed the restriction was wrong. Jackson leaned back against a crate secured with cargo straps rated for 5,000 pounds of tension. If something is designed to keep a person small, it is probably wrong. She tilted her head slightly, studying him again with that analytical gaze. On my world, obedience is considered strength. On mine, he replied, questioning is. The corner of her mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but close enough to register. She set the container aside and looked toward the star field beyond the viewport. My father believes I cannot lead because I cannot stand unaided. He does not understand that leadership does not begin in the legs. Jackson folded his arms. He understands, he said. He just does not benefit from it. A faint alert tone chimed from the cockpit. Jackson stepped forward, glancing at the navigation display. An encrypted ping had brushed against their outer sensor net, too faint for a standard vessel, too deliberate for debris. He adjusted the frequency filters and isolated the signal. It originated from a high-orbit relay near the Baron's territory. Not an attack. A marker. A breadcrumb. He is tracking us, Lyra said softly, reading the tension in Jackson's posture. Yes, Jackson answered. He tapped a sequence into the console, rerouting their course by 3 degrees and powering down non-essential emitters to reduce their signature. The shuttle responded with a subtle change in engine tone. Then we must decide, Lyra continued, voice steady despite the implications. Do we run indefinitely, or do we confront the narrative he has written for us? Jackson considered the question for a long moment, watching the stars adjust to their new vector. He thought of the throne room, of the laughter, of the word inconvenience spoken about a daughter. He thought of the small, deliberate flex of her toes against the footrest. We do not run, he said finally, but we choose the battlefield. Lyra's gaze sharpened, the faint luminescence along her temples pulsing with renewed intensity. I possess evidence, she said. Financial transfers, communications, agreements that violate even our own rigid codes. He hid them within my personal archive, believing no one would suspect a confined heir. Jackson looked at her fully then, understanding dawning. You were never the liability, he said. You were the vault. A slow, controlled breath left her lips. Yes. The shuttle continued forward through the quiet expanse, engines steady, hull reflecting distant starlight. In the silence that followed, something unspoken settled between them. Not dependency, not obligation, partnership. And somewhere far behind them, a Baron who had believed he discarded a burden was beginning to realize he had released a catalyst. The shuttle drifted beyond the Baron's primary sensor range, engines reduced to a low, efficient burn that felt more like a steady breath than propulsion. Jackson Reed adjusted the star map with a flick of his fingers, redirecting their course toward a neutral trade station known as Meridian Outpost, a rotating hub nearly 200,000 miles from the nearest sovereign claim. It was not glamorous, but it was independent, and independence was currency. Behind him, Lyra remained in the cargo bay, her mobility frame recalibrated to 70% output, the faint hum beneath her seat steady and controlled. The sound no longer carried strain. It carried promise. Jackson stepped back into the cargo hold and found her accessing a holographic projection from her personal archive. Translucent data streams floated in midair, columns of financial transfers, diplomatic communiques, and encoded authorizations that bore the unmistakable signature of Baron Virex. The glow from the projection reflected across her blue-silver skin, casting shifting patterns of light along her cheekbones. How long have you been compiling this? Jackson asked quietly. Since the accident. She replied without looking away from the data. When my mobility changed, so did my value in his eyes. I became invisible in rooms where I once commanded attention. Invisibility is useful. Jackson studied the layered encryption fields wrapping each file. You hid it inside your personal medical logs. No one questions a disabled heir reviewing her own treatment history, Lyra said. There was no self-pity in her tone, only precision. Jackson leaned against the bulkhead, arms folded. You knew he might discard you. I knew he underestimated me, she corrected. The shuttle's internal clock ticked forward in quiet increments, marking time in steady electronic pulses. Jackson moved to the cockpit and initiated a secure uplink to Meridian's public arbitration network. The station's beacon responded with a neutral handshake code, confirming reception within acceptable parameters. He returned to the cargo bay. If we transmit this, he said, gesturing toward the floating data, there is no going back. Your father will lose allies. You may gain enemies. Lyra's hands rested calmly on the control interface of her projection. He already considered me expendable. The difference now is that I am choosing the moment. Jackson nodded once. Then we do it right. He knelt beside her chair and checked the neural readouts again. Muscle engagement had improved by another 5% in the past hour, the system responding faster to her commands. Before we send anything, I want you stronger, he said. Not because you need to stand for optics, but because you deserve to. Lyra looked down at her legs, then back at him. On my world, strength has always been defined by spectacle, she said softly. You define it differently. On my world, Jackson replied. Strength is getting back up even when no one is watching. She considered that, the faint bioluminescent lines along her temples glowing a shade brighter. Then let us prepare, she said. Jackson powered down the holographic display and assisted her in repositioning the frame's balance settings. He adjusted the actuator thresholds to 80%, carefully monitoring feedback to avoid neural fatigue. The motors engaged with a deeper resonance. All right, he said calmly. Slow and steady. Lyra placed her hands firmly on the armrests and issued the command. The frame responded. Her knees extended further than before, lifting her several inches higher, her torso rising with deliberate control. It was not yet a full stand, but it was unmistakably progress. The cargo bay lights reflected off the alloy floor as her shadow stretched taller than it had since before her injury. She held the position for 3 full seconds before easing back down, breathing evenly. Jackson did not applaud. He simply met her eyes. You are not discarded, he said. You are deferred. Outside, Meridian Outpost rotated slowly against the star field, its docking rings illuminated like a quiet promise. And inside the shuttle, a partnership solidified not through grand declarations, but through calibration, choice, and the steady hum of something finally allowed to reach its full power. Meridian Outpost expanded across the viewport like a slow-turning crown of steel and glass, its docking rings rotating in measured silence against the black canvas of space. Jackson Reed guided the shuttle into approach vector, hands steady on the controls as station traffic beacons blinked green in precise intervals. The hull vibrated faintly as external scanners swept across them, mapping mass, power signatures, and declared cargo. Neutral territory meant rules, and rules meant witnesses. Docking Bay 12, Jackson said, more to the ship than to Lyra. Public concourse access. No private corridors. Lyra understood the implication. Visibility was protection. The shuttle eased into the berth with a soft magnetic thud, clamps locking in place with a metallic click that echoed through the frame. The engines powered down, leaving. Only the low hum of life support and the steady resonance of her mobility system now calibrated to 80%. Jackson rose from the cockpit and stepped back into the cargo bay. Lyra had already initiated her archive projection again, the data streams floating in quiet orbit around her like patient constellations. Once we connect to Meridian's arbitration network, she said, the files will be time-stamped and mirrored across 3 independent servers. They cannot be erased without public inquiry. Jackson nodded. Then we walk in together, once and step back, activating a public record flag that caused the terminal display to mirror across nearby screens. Whispers rippled through the concourse like wind through tall grass. The progress bar reached 90%. Jackson felt the weight of the moment settle, not heavy, but definitive. There would be consequences. There would be backlash. But there would also be record. The upload completed with a soft tone that sounded almost gentle. Lyra exhaled slowly, shoulders relaxing by a fraction. It is done, she said. Jackson looked at her, then at the surrounding crowd, then back at the quiet glow of the terminal now marked with an official arbitration seal. No, he replied softly. It has begun. And as the mirrored files propagated across Meridian's network, the narrative written in a crystal throne room began to fracture under the simple power of visibility and choice. The concourse did not erupt. It did not descend into chaos. Instead, it changed temperature. Conversations softened into careful murmurs as the arbitration seal pulsed gently above the terminal, confirming that Lyra's submission had entered formal review. Meridian Outpost thrived on neutrality, and neutrality had a sound. It sounded like measured breathing, like the distant hum of rotating rings and regulated airflow, like the quiet recalibration of power structures behind polite expressions. Jackson Reed stood beside Lyra without shifting his stance. He did not scan for threats. He scanned for patterns. Across the concourse, a tall figure in tailored cobalt attire paused mid-step, reading the mirrored display on an overhead screen. Two more individuals, their garments marked with discrete insignia of minor houses aligned to Baron Virex, exchanged glances and activated personal communicators. Information moved faster than ships. Lyra's hands rested calmly on her console interface, but Jackson could see the faint increase in neural output on the small diagnostic strip still embedded in her mobility frame. Not stress. Focus. They will contact him, she said quietly. They already have, Jackson replied. He nodded toward a hovering news drone that had drifted closer, its lens adjusting aperture to capture the projection in crisp detail. Meridian's independent media thrived on verified documentation. This was verified. A station official approached again, this time accompanied by a representative from the Arbitration Council. The representative's voice carried a professional neutrality, sharpened by curiosity. Lady Lyra Voss, he began, addressing her with deliberate respect. Your submission has triggered a preliminary inquiry under Meridian Accord Statute 9. Given the gravity of the material, you are entitled to public statement. Lyra looked up at him, then at the gathering crowd, then briefly at Jackson. He gave the smallest nod. Not encouragement. Not instruction. Affirmation. She engaged the height adjustment on her frame, raising herself another 3 inches. The motors responded smoothly, stronger now than they had been an hour ago. When she spoke, her voice carried across the concourse without amplification. For cycles, my mobility has been cited as proof of my inadequacy, she said. For cycles, decisions were made in rooms where I was present yet discounted. Today, I present records that speak without embellishment. I do not seek spectacle. I seek transparency. The words were measured, deliberate, free of accusation, yet impossible to ignore. Jackson watched the effect ripple outward. Some faces registered disbelief. Others, recognition. A few, quiet approval. Leadership did not always require standing. It required clarity. A chime echoed from the terminal, signaling that external review nodes had begun mirroring the inquiry beyond Meridian's network. The data was no longer confined to a single station. It was traveling. Lyra exhaled slowly, then lowered herself back to a balanced position. He will respond, she said softly to Jackson. He will attempt to discredit me. Jackson's gaze remained steady. Then we make sure you are not alone when he does. As if summoned by inevitability, a new transmission alert flashed across the nearest public screen. The crest of Baron Virex materialized in rotating holographic form, requesting immediate broadcast rights under diplomatic privilege. A murmur swept through the concourse. The Arbitration Council representative hesitated, then granted conditional access. The crest expanded, stabilizing into a live image of the Baron seated in his crystalline hall. His expression was controlled, his posture immaculate. Daughter, he began, voice smooth and amplified through Meridian speakers. You appear confused. Lyra did not flinch. Jackson felt the weight of the moment settle again, but this time it was different. It was not fear. It was convergence. He stepped half a pace closer, not shielding her, not overshadowing her, simply present in frame. The concourse fell silent as the father who had dismissed her now faced a network that had already archived her truth. And for the first time, the balance between them was no longer determined by height, by mobility, or by inherited authority. It was determined by record, by witness, and by the quiet strength of a choice made in full view of the stars. The Baron's image stabilized above the concourse in flawless resolution, every facet of the crystalline hall behind him rendered in sharp geometric clarity. His blue-silver skin reflected the ambient light of his throne room, immaculate and controlled, as though the narrative itself answered to him. Daughter, he repeated, voice smooth as polished glass. Your condition has clearly impaired your judgment. The documents you have presented are misinterpreted fragments of routine governance. A faint ripple of disapproval moved through the gathered crowd at the phrasing. Condition. Impaired. Jackson Reed felt Lyra's mobility frame hum softly beside him, the diagnostic strip along its edge registering a steady neural rhythm. She was not destabilized. She was calculating. The Arbitration Council representative folded his hands behind his back, eyes shifting between the Baron's projection and the mirrored files still glowing above the terminal. Baron Virex, he said evenly. The submissions include verified transaction keys and timestamp directives bearing your personal authorization signature. The Baron inclined his head slightly, as if humoring a minor inconvenience. High-level governance requires discretion, he replied. My daughter has mistaken complexity for corruption. Lyra engaged the forward projection interface again. A new data cluster unfolded in midair, isolating a specific sequence of transfers routed through shell corporations tied to resource extraction contracts prohibited under interstellar accord. The hologram rotated slowly, undeniable in its clarity. This is not complexity, Lyra said, her voice calm, resonant, unhurried. This is diversion. She magnified a section of the file, revealing a biometric confirmation string unique to the Baron's own neural imprint. The concourse screens updated simultaneously, displaying the confirmation match percentage in bold numerals. 99.8%. The Baron's expression did not fracture, but the pause before his next breath extended half a second too long. Jackson noticed. So did the crowd. Biometric strings can be replicated, the Baron countered smoothly. Surely Meridian's officials understand the sophistication of modern forgery. Jackson stepped forward then, not into dominance, but into frame. Not this one, he said, voice steady, carrying just enough to be captured by the station microphones. He tapped a command into the relay chip he had inserted earlier. A cross-reference grid appeared beside Lyra's projection, overlaying the Baron's imprint with a secondary confirmation from a private vault registry. The biometric match is linked to a physical authorization node inside your personal chamber, Jackson continued. The registry confirms location and timestamp. It is not remote. It is you. Silence settled like a measured weight. The Arbitration Council representative glanced down at his wrist console, verifying the cross-reference in real time. Around them, civilians stood still, traders and diplomats momentarily unified by the gravity of documented fact. Lyra adjusted her frame again, rising another inch, her posture aligning not out of display, but stability. Father, she said, not with accusation, but with clarity, you believed I would remain silent because standing required assistance. You believed visibility required perfection. You were incorrect. The Baron's gaze sharpened, the first hint of strain tightening the edges of his composure. You overestimate the patience of our allies, he said quietly. Power favors continuity. No, Lyra replied, her bioluminescent markings brightening with steady resolve. Power favors legitimacy. The word hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. The Arbitration Council representative cleared his throat. Under Meridian Accord Statute 9, a formal review panel will be convened. Pending inquiry, baronial trade privileges are temporarily suspended. The announcement echoed softly through the concourse speakers. A collective intake of breath followed. The Baron's projection flickered almost imperceptibly, then stabilized again. He offered no further argument. Instead, his image dimmed, crest dissolving into static before vanishing entirely. The concourse did not cheer. It did not erupt. It simply exhaled. Jackson turned toward Lyra. She remained upright within her frame, eyes forward, shoulders squared. The shadow she cast against the alloy floor stretched longer now, not because she stood unaided, but because she had stood undeniable. And in that measured silence, the balance of authority shifted not with spectacle, but with proof. Meridian Outpost rotated in slow, deliberate silence as the arbitration seal remained suspended above the concourse terminal, glowing with official authority. The crowd had begun to disperse, not in dismissal, but in acceptance. News drones hovered at a respectful distance, their lenses dimmed now that spectacle had given way to process. Jackson Reed stood beside Lyra Voss as station officials initiated formal review protocols. Notifications pulsed quietly across public displays, confirming suspension of baronial trade privileges pending inquiry. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was structural correction, the kind that reshaped futures without raising a single voice. Lyra's mobility frame hummed at 80%. Output, steady and responsive. The faint bioluminescent lines along her temples had softened, their intensity no longer signaling strain but equilibrium. She remained upright within the frame, posture composed, chin level. Jackson glanced at the diagnostic strip along the armrest. Neural engagement had increased again, marginally but consistently. Recovery was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. The Arbitration Council representative approached once more, this time with a document projection bearing the official crest of Provisional Succession Review. Lady Lyra Voss, he said formally, pending confirmation of the inquiry's findings, you are recognized as acting claimant to the Virex estate under Clause 12 of the Sovereign Integrity Charter. A faint hush settled around them again. Recognition carried weight. Lyra absorbed the statement without visible triumph. Acknowledged, she replied evenly. My intent is not inheritance for its own sake. It is restoration. The representative inclined his head. Restoration requires legitimacy. Today, you have demonstrated it. He stepped back, leaving them framed by the quiet glow of Meridian's concourse lighting. Jackson folded his arms loosely, eyes scanning the curved corridor where merchants resumed business and diplomats resumed negotiations. The world had not ended. It had adjusted. Lyra turned toward him, her gaze steady. You could leave now, she said softly. Your role in this was voluntary. Jackson allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. So was yours. She regarded him for a long moment, then engaged the height adjustment once more. The actuators responded with a confident hum. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted her weight forward. Her feet pressed firmly against the alloy floor. The frame supported her, but did not carry her. She rose, not fully unaided, not yet independent of the system Jackson had recalibrated, but undeniably vertical. The motion was controlled, balanced, earned. The shadow she cast extended tall across the polished surface, intersecting with his own. A few station officials paused mid-step, observing without commentary. Leadership did not need applause. It needed evidence. Lyra took one measured step forward, then another, each approximately 12 inches, each deliberate. The frame adjusted dynamically to her neural input, no longer dampened, no longer constrained. She stopped beside Jackson, standing at near equal height, and looked out toward the broad viewport where the stars shimmered beyond Meridian's rotating rings. He believed potential was measured by spectacle, she said quietly. He believed worth required perfection. Jackson followed her gaze to the distant star. Field. He measured wrong. She removed a small insignia from the console panel of her mobility frame, a discreet emblem bearing the Virex crest. For a moment she studied it, then turned it over and handed it to Jackson. Keep this, she said. Not as property, as witness. Jackson accepted it without ceremony. The metal felt cool and solid in his palm. What happens now, he asked. Lyra's eyes reflected the distant stars, bright and steady. Now, she said, we rebuild correctly. The station lights dimmed slightly as Meridian shifted rotational phase, casting a softer glow across the concourse. Around them, commerce continued, alliances recalculated, and the machinery of governance turned with renewed precision. No cheers, no grand declarations, just a quiet recalibration of power grounded in record and choice. And beside a human who had refused to see her as a joke, Lyra Voss stood not because she had been carried, but because she had been believed.